Imagine a world where the sun dimmed, crops failed, and darkness lingered for months, a year that terrified entire civilizations, leaving famine, disease, and despair in its wake. This was 536 AD, often called the worst year to live. Today, we journey back through time to uncover the mysteries, struggles, and lessons of this dark chapter in human history. Prepare to witness how humanity endured when the very fabric of life was challenged. I want you to imagine a world suddenly plunged into shadow. The sun, once a constant in our lives, lost its brilliance, casting a dim, muted glow over the earth. Date, I'm no longer felt like day. The sky, often a comforting canopy of blue, was now a hazy gray, thick with an oppressive presence that seemed almost alive. I try to picture what it would have felt like for those living in that time, standing in fields, looking up at a sky that betrayed them, unsure if light would ever return. I feel the chill creeping into my bones even as I recount this. How unsettling it must have been when a fundamental certainty, the sun's daily presence, no longer behaved as it always had. The chroniclers of that era wrote with a mixture of fear, awe, and confusion. They described a sun, dimmed as though covered by a veil of smoke or ash. Its light weakened to the point that midday appeared like a perpetual twilight. I think about their perspective of people whose lives were governed by the rhythms of nature, by the rising and setting of the sun, the seasons, the weather patterns that dictated planting and harvest. These were not abstract concepts to them. They were life itself. When these rhythms faltered, it must have seemed as if the world itself was rebelling against them. I feel that fear deeply as I read their words, a fear that is both primal and universal. I can almost hear the whispers among villagers as they speculate on the cause. Some might have attributed it to the wrath of the gods, imagining that some cosmic punishment had been unleashed upon humanity. Others perhaps feared the end of the world, recalling prophecies or legends about darkness and catastrophe. I find myself transported into their minds, where superstition and faith intertwine with observation. I sense the urgency in their daily lives, not just to survive, but to interpret the meaning of what was happening around them. Every shadow, every cold gust of wind, every day without proper sunlight carried a moral and existential weight. The environmental effects of this darkness were immediate and tangible. Crops failed in fields where they should have flourished. Seeds that once sprouted reliably refused to grow under the diminished light, or they grew weak and stunted, providing little nourishment. I imagine farmers tending to their lands with growing desperation, feeling helpless as nature itself seemed to betray them. The earth, which had always promised sustenance, now delivered uncertainty and scarcity. Families who relied on the rhythm of planting and harvesting for survival faced a future that felt increasingly unstable, each passing day amplifying the anxiety that gripped their communities. Food scarcity became a daily reality, and the emotional toll was immense. I picture mothers and fathers staring at empty granaries, counting the little they had, rationing it carefully among children and elders. Villages whispered of others a few miles away who had perished or fled. The social fabric, once a source of security, was strained. I feel their despair, the helplessness, and the tension that must have filled households. Hunger is not just a physical sensation. It penetrates the mind, fueling anxiety, despair, and fear of what tomorrow might bring. Standing in that imagined village square, I can almost hear the muted groans of families and the murmurs of prayers for reprieve. Yet, amid fear and suffering, human resilience began to emerge. I think about the small acts of perseverance, families sharing what little they had, neighbors helping each other tend to weak crops, communities attempting to maintain order and hope despite the darkness. I feel inspired by the courage it took to endure, even when nature itself seemed cruel and unforgiving. survival became an act of constant vigilance, creativity, and faith. I reflect on the tension between fear and hope, despair and determination, and I sense that these are universal aspects of the human condition that resonate across centuries. The darkness affected not only physical survival, but also psychological well-being. I imagine people waking each day, uncertain whether the sun would provide enough light for them to work or find food. Anxiety must have been pervasive, infiltrating every conversation, every decision. I think about the children growing up in these shadowed conditions, learning to live in uncertainty, forming memories of a world that was not as it should be. I feel a deep empathy for them, for the generation shaped by fear and scarcity, whose early experiences would color their understanding of life and survival. As I reflect, I also consider the broader human context. Empires, kingdoms, and communities that had seemed stable suddenly faced new vulnerabilities. Political leaders were forced to respond to the crisis, making difficult decisions about the distribution of food and the maintenance of order. I imagine emperors, kings, and local officials poring over reports of famine, weighing their capacity to intervene, and confronting the stark reality that even the most powerful could not control the elements. The darkness, in effect, became a great equalizer, humbling rulers and subjects alike. I sense the pressure, the moral dilemmas, and the tension inherent in leadership during times of environmental catastrophe. The cultural response to this darkness was fascinating. People turned to religion, ritual, and storytelling to make sense of what was happening. I imagine gatherings in temples, churches, and homes where communities sought guidance, solace, and explanations. I feel their yearning for understanding, the human need to impose meaning on chaos. In some ways, this crisis spurred creativity as people attempted to articulate their experiences, record the events, and pass down lessons to future generations. The darkness, though terrifying, became a catalyst for reflection and for the codification of memory. I also try to visualize the landscapes affected by the dim sun. Forests seemed darker, rivers colder, and mountains shrouded in an unusual mist. I feel the eeriness of a world where even familiar places no longer seemed comforting. Travelers and merchants would have been cautious, navigating through a shadowed environment, uncertain about what dangers lay ahead. I sense the tension between exploration and survival, between curiosity and fear. Everyday life became a negotiation with an unpredictable and sometimes hostile environment. This period also reminds me of the fragility of human reliance on nature. A single environmental disruption could cascade into famine, social unrest, and mortality. I reflect on how communities had to rapidly adapt or face extinction. I feel a connection with them, recognizing that human ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience were not modern inventions. They have been essential since time immemorial. Observing their strategies to survive, the rationing of food, the migration to more fertile lands, the reliance on communal support, I feel admiration for their tenacity and resourcefulness. As I recount these events, I am struck by the contrast between historical perception and modern understanding. At the time, people experienced darkness as an existential threat, interpreting it through religious, moral, or mystical frameworks. Today, we can analyze tree rings, ice cores, and volcanic deposits to reconstruct what happened scientifically. I feel a sense of humility, realizing that while we can now explain the mechanisms, the lived experience of those who endured the darkness remains vivid, raw, and profoundly human. I imagine that even with explanations, the emotional impact of living in such conditions would have been overwhelming, shaping their world, in ways we can only begin to appreciate. The interconnectedness of climate, survival, and social stability becomes clear as I reflect on this period. One environmental anomaly triggered a cascade of consequences. Crop failures led to hunger, which weakened populations, which in turn increased susceptibility to disease and social unrest. I feel the complexity of these chains of cause and effect, appreciating how fragile yet interdependent human societies are. The lessons of 536 resonate because they remind us that the natural world is not separate from human existence. It is deeply entwined with our survival, culture, and governance. Finally, as I imagine myself standing in that shadowed year, I feel both awe and empathy. I see the world as it was a place where darkness ruled the skies and fear gripped hearts. I feel the struggle of families, the burden on leaders, the anxiety of children, and the determination of communities trying to endure. I understand that this is not merely a historical curiosity, but a profound reminder of human resilience and adaptability. As I guide you through this story, I want you to feel what it might have been like, to walk alongside those who endured the darkness, and to reflect on the enduring lessons that echo even in our modern world. As I look closer at the events of 536 AD, I realize that what seemed like mere darkness was actually a profound environmental anomaly, a disruption so vast it reshaped the climate and the lives of every human being on the planet. I try to imagine standing in those days, feeling the chill in the air, noticing how summers failed to warm the earth as they once did, and observing crops that refused to grow despite careful planting. The phenomenon was not local, it was global. From Europe to Asia, the evidence of this climatic disruption is etched in tree rings, ice cores, and historical chronicles, each record silently testifying to the magnitude of what occurred. I feel the enormity of it pressing down, not as a single disaster, but as a cascade of environmental upheavals that tested humanity's capacity to endure. The scientific explanations for this darkness are fascinating, and I find myself captivated by the scale of natural forces at play. Modern research points to massive volcanic eruptions as the primary catalyst. I visualize plumes of ash and sulfur dioxide erupting into the stratosphere, carried by winds across continents, forming a veil that reflected sunlight away from the Earth. This was no ordinary eruption. The sheer volume of particulate matter altered global temperatures, reducing sunlight for months, if not years. I imagined the sky as they saw it, dim, gray, and oppressive, a constant reminder of forces beyond human control. The sun, which had always been reliable, now seemed distant, weak, and unreliable. As I reflect on the human experience, I feel the confusion and fear that must have gripped communities. Without modern science to explain what was happening, people likely turned to religion, superstition, and speculation. Some may have interpreted the darkness as divine punishment, others as a harbinger of the apocalypse. I try to put myself in their shoes, a farmer looking at his failing crops, a merchant observing trade falter due to scarcity, a parent worrying about the survival of their children. The environmental anomaly wasn't merely a scientific curiosity. It was a visceral, existential crisis. Every human action was now shadowed by uncertainty, and every day felt like a negotiation with an unpredictable natural world. The effects on agriculture were immediate and devastating. I picture myself walking through fields that should have been lush with grain and vegetables, only to find them stunted, wilted, and failing to produce. Harvests were reduced or entirely lost, and famine became a looming threat. Communities that had once depended on the predictability of seasons now faced profound insecurity. I think about how this would have affected trade, merchants traveling long distances to sell grain, only to find supply unreliable, markets destabilized, wealth concentrated in the hands of those who could store food, while the poor suffered most acutely. The climatic anomaly, in other words, had consequences far beyond the weather. It disrupted the economic and social fabric of societies. Temperature records reconstructed from tree rings tell a story of persistent cold, one that did not simply last a few months but extended for years. I imagine summers that should have brought warmth, light, and growth, instead bringing unseasonable frost or cool winds. Rivers and lakes may have been colder, forests less dense, and snowfall occurring at unusual times. The chill must have been oppressive, affecting human health, livestock survival, and agricultural productivity. As I envision this, I feel the fragility of human dependence on climate, realizing that even a single year of extreme anomaly could ripple outward, impacting communities, governments, and civilizations. The volcanic winter created not only cold, but also a sky filled with dust and ash. I picture the air carrying a faint, acrid smell, sunlight diffused into a perpetual twilight, and stars shining more faintly or appearing distorted through the haze. Daily life was transformed. Outdoor work became difficult, journeys dangerous, and food production uncertain. I try to imagine how people adapted, changing work hours to maximize light, conserving energy and food, relying on communal sharing, or even moving to more fertile areas. I feel admiration for the resilience that communities exhibited in the face of such extreme environmental stress. Disease became another consequence intertwined with the climatic anomaly. Crops failing meant that populations were malnourished, and weakened immune systems made communities more vulnerable to pathogens. Although the Justinian plague would strike a decade later, I can see how the environmental stresses of the volcanic winter set the stage for such epidemics. I imagine villages struggling not only to survive the cold and scarcity, but also fearing sickness, the compounding anxiety and mortality creating a cycle of vulnerability. I feel the human suffering as intensely as if I were walking among those communities, witnessing lives stretched thin by forces they could neither predict nor control. Modern research into volcanic eruptions provides a clearer sense of scale. I imagine an eruption so massive that it expelled tens of cubic kilometers of ash and gas into the atmosphere. This material traveled across continents, settling in layers upon glaciers and soils, evidence that scientists can now analyze centuries later. I think about the sheer force of nature required to produce this effect, and I feel a mixture of awe and humility. It reminds me that while humans are powerful, we are deeply subject to the forces of the natural world, capable of great innovation, but still vulnerable to the scale and unpredictability of volcanic and climatic phenomena. The human response to this climatic anomaly is equally fascinating. I imagine communities improvising, altering planting schedules, storing food more carefully, and finding ways to mitigate the worst impacts. I feel the tension between desperation and creativity as people sought to endure despite uncertainty. Political leaders were forced to act, perhaps organizing relief, rationing supplies, or reallocating resources to stabilize regions under their control. I imagine the moral and logistical dilemmas, how to prioritize limited food, which communities receive assistance, and how to maintain social cohesion when anxiety is widespread. The volcanic winter tested every aspect of human organization, from family units to empires. Historical accounts describe famine, social unrest, and migration, and I can see how these events are linked directly to the climatic anomaly. People moved in search of food and safety, altering population distribution and putting pressure on neighboring regions. Markets collapsed as production faltered and social hierarchies were strained. I try to visualize the long caravans of people traveling in hope of sustenance, the tension and uncertainty along every road. I feel empathy for the migrants who were forced to adapt to new lands, climates, and communities in order to survive. The psychological impact of living through such an anomaly cannot be overstated. I imagine the fear of uncertainty, the constant calculation of risk, and the anxiety over survival. Communities likely clung to ritual, religion, and storytelling to find meaning and reassurance in a world that seemed suddenly unpredictable. I feel the human need for narrative, for explanation, for hope amidst despair. These cultural responses were as vital as food and shelter, helping people endure a reality where environmental forces had rendered life fragile and precarious. The volcanic winter also had far-reaching economic consequences. Trade networks that relied on predictable production faltered, prices for food skyrocketed, and wealth inequalities deepened. I imagine merchants watching their livelihoods vanish, peasants struggling to maintain subsistence, and rulers grappling with the destabilization of taxes and tribute. The climatic anomaly created a ripple effect, showing me how dependent human systems are on stable environmental conditions. Every disruption reverberated across societies, highlighting the delicate interdependence between nature and human civilization. I also consider the global scope of the anomaly. Ice core evidence shows that the effects were not confined to a single region. I envision a world where Europe, Asia, and perhaps even the Middle East were simultaneously experiencing crop failures, colder temperatures, and shorter growing seasons. This is staggering to imagine. The entire planet, or large portions of it, enduring environmental stress at once. I feel a deep connection to the people of that era, recognizing that their struggles were mirrored across continents, a shared human experience bound together by the forces of the earth itself. As I reflect, I realize that the climatic anomaly of 536 was not simply a backdrop to human suffering. It was an active, shaping force. I imagine the way it influenced decisions, behaviors, and adaptations. Communities became more resourceful. Societies had to reconsider agricultural and social strategies, and human resilience was tested in unprecedented ways. I feel inspired by their adaptability, their capacity to endure, and their ability to find hope even as sunlight faded and temperatures dropped. In modern times, I feel a sense of wonder at how science allows us to reconstruct these events. Clearing data, ice cores, and sediment analysis let us quantify temperature drops, volcanic intensity, and atmospheric composition. I feel a connection between past and present, understanding not only what happened, but how it affected human societies, health, and political structures. It is humbling to realize that even without historical texts, the Earth itself preserves the memory of 536, allowing us to learn from the resilience and vulnerability of our ancestors. I also reflect on the lessons this climatic anomaly provides today. I consider how a single year of environmental disruption can cascade into famine, disease, and social upheaval. I feel a profound relevance in the context of modern climate challenges. Extreme weather events, volcanic eruptions, or global environmental shifts could similarly affect food security, health, and social stability. Studying 536 helps me understand the importance of preparedness, adaptation, and cooperation. It teaches me that resilience is not optional. It is essential for survival in the face of forces that humans cannot control. As I recount these events, I imagine standing in the shadow of the volcanic plumes, feeling the chill, seeing the dimmed sun, and listening to the anxiety that pervaded every village, town, and city. I feel the magnitude of the anomaly, the human responses, and the cascading consequences. I understand that this was not just a single year of darkness. It was a pivotal environmental event that reshaped human history, altering population patterns, governance, agriculture, and culture. I feel both awe and empathy, recognizing the vast forces of nature and the remarkable endurance of humanity in the face of such adversity. The volcanic winter of 536 teaches me that human civilization is intricately bound to the natural world. I reflect on the ways in which the environment can shape every facet of life, economics, politics, health, and culture. I feel the weight of this lesson as I think about the vulnerability and resilience embedded in our species. The darkness, the cold, and the scarcity were not merely temporary conditions. They were transformative experiences that forced humans to adapt, survive, and rethink their relationship with the planet. Standing in this historical imagination, I sense a profound connection across time. I am linked to the people of 536, to their fears, strategies, and perseverance. I feel their triumphs and their losses, their ingenuity and their despair. And as I share this story, I hope that you too can feel the magnitude of the climatic anomaly, the power of the volcanic winter, and the resilience of those who endured when the world itself seemed to falter. Their experience is not just a lesson in history. It is a mirror reflecting the challenges we may face in our own time and the enduring capacity of humanity to survive, adapt, and endure against all odds. As I reflect on the year 536 AD, I cannot help but dwell on the profound human suffering that unfolded during this extraordinary period. The environmental anomalies, the volcanic winter, and the dimmed sun were not merely distant phenomena. They were forces that shaped the daily lives of every person living at that time. I tried to picture myself in their shoes, walking through villages where once thriving fields now lay stunted and barren. I can almost feel the gnawing hunger in households, the quiet despair as families rationed meager portions of food in a desperate attempt to survive. Every meal, every decision about consumption, carried immense weight. Survival was no longer a guarantee. It had become a daily struggle, a precarious balance between life and death. I think about the farmers first, the backbone of every community. These were people whose lives were intimately tied to the land, who understood the rhythms of planting and harvesting, who relied on the sun's warmth to nurture their crops. Yet in 536, the sun itself had betrayed them. I imagine a farmer standing in his field, inspecting seedlings that refused to grow, grains that withered before ripening, vegetables shriveling under an unfamiliar chill. I can feel his frustration, his fear, and the creeping sense of helplessness. He knows that the crops are the lifeline for his family and community, yet nature is no longer predictable. I sense the anxiety and desperation, and it is impossible not to feel empathy for someone whose survival hinges on forces beyond their control. Famine followed inevitably. I envision villages where granaries, once filled with the fruits of careful labor, now held barely enough to sustain a few families for a week. Hunger is a physical pain, but it is also psychological, a constant reminder of vulnerability. I can almost hear the murmurs among families, whispers of fear and uncertainty, stories of neighbors who have already succumbed to starvation. I feel the collective anxiety that must have hung over communities like a heavy fog. Children, the most vulnerable, would have been the first to show signs of malnutrition, their growth stunted, their health weakened, their futures uncertain. I imagine the anguish of parents who could only watch, powerless, as their children suffered. Disease became a companion to famine. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them more susceptible to illness. I picture crowded villages where sanitation is minimal and the immune systems of residents are compromised. In these conditions, even minor ailments can become deadly. I think about the elderly who, already frail, would have struggled to endure cold and hunger. I reflect on the psychological toll, how fear, grief, and exhaustion compounded the physical suffering. Life in 536 was not simply hard. It was a continuous negotiation with death, with every decision a gamble in the face of scarcity and uncertainty. I also consider the social dynamics created by famine. I imagine neighbors once bound by trust and community suddenly forced into difficult choices. Food sharing, once a natural extension of communal life, might have become fraught with tension. I feel the subtle undercurrents of anxiety and suspicion as people tried to protect their families while maintaining fragile relationships with others. Theft, desperation, and conflict would have been natural consequences in such extreme conditions. Yet I also see acts of courage and altruism, families quietly sharing what little they had, communities organizing relief, and individuals risking their safety to aid others. Human nature, in this context, was revealed in all its complexity, fearful yet compassionate, selfish yet generous. The psychological impact of famine cannot be overstated. I imagine waking each day uncertain whether there would be enough food to survive, wondering how long hunger could persist, and fearing what new challenges might arise. I feel the anxiety, the hopelessness, and the strain on human spirit. In times like these, even routine activities, walking to the well, tending animals, or preparing simple meals became monumental tasks. I sense the toll on mental health, the despair that could easily overwhelm those unprepared for such sustained hardship. It is a reminder that suffering is not just physical, but deeply emotional and cognitive, shaping individuals and communities alike. Historical chronicles from the period amplify this picture. I read accounts of people migrating in search of sustenance, of villages abandoned as families sought fertile land elsewhere. I can almost walk alongside these travelers, feeling their fatigue, the uncertainty of each step, and the faint hope that survival might be found elsewhere. Roads would have been crowded with those fleeing famine, a human tide moving across landscapes already burdened by environmental stress. I feel the courage it must have taken to leave home, the resilience required to face the unknown, and the sadness of leaving familiar lands and memories behind. I also consider the broader economic implications. Markets were destabilized, and trade faltered as scarcity drove prices higher and made essential goods inaccessible. I imagine merchants whose livelihoods depended on reliable supply chains now struggling to obtain goods, communities paying inflated prices, and inequality deepening as resources became concentrated in the hands of a few. I feel the tension between survival and justice as the basic necessities of life became commodities of immense value. The social fabric, once stable, now strained under pressure, highlighting the interconnectedness of environment, economy, and human well-being. The famine of 536 also had profound cultural and religious impacts. People sought meaning in their suffering, turning to rituals, prayers, and spiritual interpretations to make sense of a world that seemed suddenly cruel and unpredictable. I picture gatherings in temples, churches, and homes where communities sought solace and guidance. I feel their yearning for understanding, for hope, and for reassurance that life could continue despite the overwhelming challenges. Religion, storytelling, and communal rituals became essential coping mechanisms, offering a framework to endure what seemed unendurable. In imagining the daily life of a person in 536, I see the meticulous rationing of food, the careful management of livestock, the use of foraged wild plants, and the relentless search for alternative sources of nutrition. Every meal, every morsel, became a strategic decision. I can feel the calculation, the worry, and the ingenuity that humans employed to survive. Even in the darkest times, I sense the flicker of human ingenuity, the small adaptations and innovations that allowed communities to endure against seemingly insurmountable odds. Children, in particular, were vulnerable yet resilient. I picture them navigating a world of scarcity, learning early lessons about survival, cooperation, and adaptation. I feel the sadness of their deprivation, but also a sense of awe at their endurance. They grew up with an acute awareness of mortality, their formative years shaped by the uncertainty and challenges that adults struggled to manage. In these conditions, the lessons learned were hard, yet they were also formative, teaching resourcefulness, empathy, and the importance of community in survival. As I reflect, I also think about the impact on leadership and governance. Leaders faced immense pressure to provide relief, maintain order, and prevent chaos. I imagine councils and courts convening, debates about rationing, and the difficult decisions of prioritizing scarce resources. I feel the moral weight of leadership in such times, how even the most well-intentioned policies could fail, and how mistakes could cost lives. It is a stark reminder that environmental disasters ripple through every layer of society, challenging both ordinary citizens and those in positions of authority. The famine also reshaped demographics and settlement patterns. I imagine some regions depopulated as people fled to areas with better prospects, while other areas struggled under the sudden influx of displaced populations. I feel the tension between those trying to protect their own survival and those seeking refuge, the complex interplay of empathy, fear, and self-preservation that emerges in times of crisis. Migration, while necessary, brought new challenges, including competition for limited resources, social tension, and the risk of spreading disease. The human story of 536 is one of constant movement and adaptation, of navigating uncertainty at every level of life. I think about the long-term consequences of this famine. Malnutrition weakened populations, reducing their resilience against subsequent crises. I picture weakened communities vulnerable to disease, political instability, and social unrest. I feel the tragic inevitability of compounded suffering as one disaster sets the stage for another. The events of 536 were not isolated. They created a cascade of challenges that shaped generations, altering population dynamics, economic structures, and social cohesion. Yet, amid this suffering, human resilience shines through. I see communities coming together, neighbors sharing resources, and individuals taking extraordinary measures to protect loved ones. I feel a deep admiration for these acts of courage and solidarity. Even when the world seemed to be collapsing around them, humans found ways to endure, to persevere, and to support one another. This resilience, I realize, is as essential a part of the story as the famine itself. It is a testament to the human spirit and the capacity to survive even under extreme adversity. As I stand in the imagination of 536, I feel the depth of human suffering, but I also feel connection, empathy, and respect for those who endured. I can almost taste the scarcity, feel the chill in the air, hear the quiet desperation, and witness the courage that allowed people to survive. Their experience is a reminder that human suffering is not abstract. It is lived, tangible, and profound. And it is a lesson for all of us, showing the fragility of life, the importance of resilience, and the enduring power of human solidarity in the face of catastrophe. The famine of 536 teaches me that survival is not guaranteed, that life can change dramatically in a short period, and that environmental, social, and political forces are intimately connected. I feel humbled by the enormity of what people endured, and I am inspired by the courage and adaptability they demonstrated. As I share this story, I want you to feel the weight of their struggle, the resilience they showed, and the lessons that echo across centuries, reminding us of our vulnerability, our responsibility, and our capacity to endure even when the world seems determined to challenge us at every turn. As I think about the events of 536 AD, I realize that the darkness, the famine, and the chilling cold did not simply affect the environment or individual households. They reshaped the very fabric of society and tested the limits of political authority. I try to imagine myself living in a city ruled by an emperor or a local governor, where the responsibilities of leadership suddenly became a question of life and death for thousands. The sun's dimness, the failed harvests, and the scarcity of food were not abstract concepts to rulers. They were urgent crises that demanded immediate decisions, strategies, and action. Every decree, every allocation of resources carried profound consequences. I feel the immense pressure on those charged with maintaining order and providing for their people. I picture Emperor Justinian I of the Byzantine Empire, a man accustomed to wielding authority over a vast and sophisticated realm, suddenly confronted with a catastrophe that no army, no treasury, and no council could control. I imagine the stress etched on his face as he reviewed reports of failing crops, of rising food prices, of villages abandoned or on the brink of starvation. I feel the weight of his responsibility, knowing that the stability of the empire could be threatened by forces entirely beyond human control. The volcanic winter, which created famine and disease, forced leaders like Justinian to rethink priorities, to weigh the immediate needs of survival against long-term governance and political strategy. Political decisions in this period were fraught with moral and practical dilemmas. I envision councils of advisors debating how to distribute food, which cities should receive priority, and how to prevent unrest. I feel the tension in those rooms, the clash between pragmatism and ethics. Every choice could spark revolt or save lives. Every delay could mean suffering or death. Leaders had to balance justice with survival, fairness with necessity, and compassion with strategy. I sense the complexity of governing during such extreme environmental and social stress, and I marvel at the resilience required to make decisions when the usual mechanisms of control were failing. The famine and environmental disaster also exposed vulnerabilities in social structures. I imagine a world where hierarchies that once seemed stable were suddenly under pressure. Wealthy elites might have hoarded resources, while peasants and laborers struggled to survive. I feel the tension between different social classes, the resentment that builds when scarcity highlights inequality. I think about the moral questions that ordinary people faced. Should I share my meager stores with neighbors, even if it risks my family's survival? Should I obey the authority of a distant ruler or take matters into my own hands? These are not simple questions. They are the crucible in which human character and society are tested. I also reflect on the impact of famine and scarcity on local communities. Villages that had been self-sufficient now faced instability as some members left in search of food, trade networks broke down, and traditional social bonds were strained. I picture town councils convening in desperation, trying to organize relief, maintain morale, and prevent disorder. I feel the immense human effort required to keep communities functioning, even when the basic prerequisites of survival, food, warmth, safety, were in short supply. It is a reminder that social cohesion is fragile and that extreme environmental stress can rapidly destabilize even well-established societies. Migration became a significant social phenomenon during this period. I imagine families leaving their ancestral homes in search of fertile land or better prospects, traveling along uncertain routes, facing hostility or competition from other communities. I feel their fear, the uncertainty in every step, and the courage required to take such risks. Migration reshaped demographic patterns, placing stress on the regions that received newcomers, creating tension and competition, but also fostering adaptation and resilience. I reflect on how mobility, often forced by necessity, became both a survival strategy and a source of social disruption. Religion and cultural practices also played a critical role in maintaining social stability. I imagine communities turning to religious institutions, temples, and churches for guidance, solace, and coordination of relief efforts. I feel the tension between faith and pragmatism. Rituals and prayers offered psychological comfort, but practical actions, rationing, redistribution, labor organization, were essential for survival. I can see how religious leaders became central figures, guiding communities through uncertainty, mediating disputes, and providing moral frameworks in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. Political authority was often tested by rebellion and unrest. I imagine towns where the populace, hungry and desperate, questioned the competence or fairness of local leaders. I feel the tension in those streets, the whispered plans of revolt, the delicate balance between obedience and survival. Leaders had to anticipate unrest, sometimes negotiating, sometimes coercing, and always aware that failure could result in disorder or violence. The environment, in this sense, became a political actor, shaping the power dynamics of the time and forcing rulers to respond in ways that were unprecedented and urgent. I also consider the long-term implications of these political and social pressures. Communities weakened by famine and disease became more vulnerable to external threats, invasions, and political fragmentation. I imagine regional governors struggling to maintain loyalty and control, balancing the immediate needs of the people with the broader strategic interests of the state. I feel the delicate interplay between local survival and empire-wide stability, recognizing that every decision carried consequences far beyond the immediate crisis. The events of 536 demonstrate vividly how environmental and social stressors are inseparable from governance and political strategy. Trade and economic networks were profoundly affected. I picture markets emptying as crops failed, caravans halting due to scarcity or fear, and prices skyrocketing. I feel the anxiety of merchants, the frustration of consumers, and the social tension that arises when basic necessities become commodities of survival. Political leaders had to intervene, regulating trade, controlling prices, and allocating resources, often in the face of scarcity that limited the effectiveness of their actions. I sense the enormous administrative and logistical challenges involved in maintaining order and providing relief in a period of widespread environmental and social disruption. I also reflect on the resilience and ingenuity of ordinary people in this period. I imagine families devising new methods of food preservation, communities cultivating alternative crops, and neighbors pooling resources to survive. I feel admiration for these adaptations, recognizing that human ingenuity is often sparked in response to adversity. Survival required creativity, cooperation, and resourcefulness as individuals and communities navigated the compounded challenges of famine, disease, and political uncertainty. These adaptive strategies, while born of necessity, became critical components of social stability. Communication and information flow played a central role in how societies responded. I picture messengers traveling between villages, towns, and regional centers, carrying news of food availability, disease outbreaks, and political decrees. I feel the urgency and stress of this communication, recognizing that delays or misinformation could exacerbate suffering. The ability of rulers and community leaders to respond effectively depended on accurate, timely information, and the failure of these systems could have catastrophic consequences. The year 536 teaches me how crucial infrastructure, both social and logistical, is in times of crisis. I also reflect on the role of law and justice during this period. I imagine courts trying to adjudicate disputes over scarce resources, local authorities balancing enforcement with compassion, and social norms evolving in response to extreme scarcity. I feel the tension inherent in maintaining order when basic survival is at stake. Legal frameworks, social norms, and political authority were all tested, revealing both the resilience and fragility of human institutions. The crises of 536 illustrate how deeply intertwined environmental stress and political authority can be, shaping societal evolution in ways that are enduring and profound. Education and cultural transmission were affected as well. I picture children growing up in households and communities preoccupied with survival, learning practical skills, and absorbing lessons of endurance and adaptation. I feel the profound impact of these formative experiences, recognizing that the crisis did not just threaten lives in the present, it shaped the values, knowledge, and resilience of future generations. Societies had to transmit not only practical survival strategies, but also moral and cultural frameworks that enabled cohesion under extreme pressure. I consider the interplay of fear and solidarity in these social dynamics. I imagine communities where anxiety could lead to conflict, but also where cooperation and mutual aid were essential for survival. I feel the delicate balance between self-preservation and collective responsibility, recognizing that social cohesion is both a moral choice and a practical necessity in times of crisis. The political and social challenges of 536 demonstrate how environmental disruption can reveal the best and worst of human behavior, highlighting both vulnerability and resilience. As I reflect on the political impact, I also think about the broader historical consequences. I imagine weakened states struggling to defend borders, shifting alliances, and the long-term destabilization of empires. I feel the magnitude of these cascading effects, recognizing that the volcanic winter and famine did not just create immediate suffering, they reshaped the trajectory of civilizations. The decisions made by leaders, communities, and individuals in 536 had consequences that echoed through subsequent decades, influencing the rise and fall of empires, the migration of peoples, and the evolution of social norms. Finally, as I stand in the historical imagination of 536, I sense the profound connection between environmental catastrophe, human suffering, and political and social structures. I feel the pressure on leaders, the struggles of communities, and the resilience of ordinary people. I see how the Year of Darkness was not just an environmental event, but a catalyst that reshaped the human experience. The political and social impacts were profound, revealing both the fragility and adaptability of human institutions. As I share this story, I want you to feel the weight of these forces, the courage required to endure, and the lessons that remain strikingly relevant for understanding human resilience in the face of crises, both past and present. As I reflect on the events of 536 AD, I realize that the darkness, famine, and societal upheaval were not merely immediate crises. They were catalysts for profound and long-lasting changes that rippled through history. I try to picture myself standing at the crossroads of this period, observing the ways in which environmental catastrophe reshaped human societies, economies, politics, and cultures for generations to come. The volcanic winter and ensuing famine were not isolated incidents. They were turning points, forcing humanity to adapt, innovate, and reconsider its relationship with nature. I feel the weight of this history, knowing that the events of this year echo far beyond the immediate suffering of those who lived through it. One of the most significant long-term consequences was demographic change. I imagine entire villages depopulated, not just by famine, but by disease and migration. Communities weakened by malnutrition became more susceptible to illness, and the mortality rate increased sharply. I picture families torn apart, children orphaned, and generations whose lives were irrevocably altered. I feel the profound sense of loss that must have pervaded these societies as the familiar rhythms of life were disrupted and the social fabric stretched thin. Population decline also had economic consequences, as labor shortages hindered agriculture and trade, forcing communities to innovate or adapt in order to survive. Migration was another enduring effect. I imagine displaced populations moving to more fertile lands, seeking safety, food, and opportunity. These migrations reshaped demographic patterns across regions, leading to the mixing of cultures, traditions, and languages. I feel the tension and opportunity inherent in this movement, competition for resources, but also collaboration and cultural exchange. These migrations left lasting marks on the social and cultural landscapes of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Communities that had once been isolated now encountered new neighbors, ideas, and technologies, reshaping human interaction and accelerating the diffusion of knowledge. The famine and environmental stress also had profound effects on governance and political structures. I envision rulers and empires grappling with weakened populations, economic disruption, and social unrest. Some states struggled to maintain authority, while others adapted by reforming administrative systems or redistributing resources more efficiently. I feel the tension in these decisions, the necessity to respond to immediate crises while planning for long-term stability. The events of 536 revealed vulnerabilities in political systems and forced leaders to reconsider the resilience of their institutions. It is a stark reminder that environmental shocks can have cascading effects on governance, shaping the course of civilizations for decades or even centuries. Economic systems were similarly transformed. I picture trade networks disrupted by famine and migration, markets destabilized by scarcity, and wealth concentrated in the hands of those who controlled food and resources. I feel the uncertainty that merchants, artisans, and farmers experienced as traditional economic patterns were upended. In response, communities developed new strategies, alternative crops, innovative storage methods, and more resilient trade networks. I see how necessity became a driver of creativity, pushing societies to adapt to new realities. The long-term economic consequences of 536 were not just hardship. They were also catalysts for innovation, resilience, and the reconfiguration of social and economic hierarchies. Cultural and religious life was deeply affected as well. I imagine communities seeking meaning in the darkness, turning to rituals, prayers, and storytelling to make sense of the upheaval. I feel the human need for narrative, for explanation, and for hope. These cultural responses became enduring features of societal identity, shaping traditions, festivals, and moral frameworks. The crises of 536 reinforced the importance of communal solidarity and faith, leaving a legacy that influenced religious thought, literature, and art for generations. I see how these responses were both practical and psychological, helping societies endure while also embedding lessons about resilience, adaptation, and human vulnerability into the cultural consciousness. The climatic anomaly of 536 also had long-term environmental consequences. I picture the weakened agricultural systems, the deforested lands, and the altered landscapes that resulted from years of environmental stress. Soil fertility declined in some regions, forests were cut for fuel and construction, and waterways were strained by increased human activity. I feel the subtle, yet enduring, ways in which these changes shaped human settlement patterns, agricultural practices, and resource management. The events of 536 forced humanity to reconsider how it interacted with the natural world, laying the groundwork for future adaptations in land use, agriculture, and environmental stewardship. Disease and public health were profoundly affected. I imagine weakened populations, malnutrition, and disrupted sanitation creating conditions ripe for epidemics. I feel the fear and vulnerability that communities experienced, knowing that illness could strike at any time and devastate families. The long-term consequences included not only higher mortality rates, but also shifts in medical knowledge, public health practices, and societal responses to disease. Communities learned to adapt, developing strategies for quarantine, resource distribution, and care of the sick. The interplay between environmental catastrophe and public health in 536 serves as a reminder of the fragility and resilience of human populations. Political and social structures were also reshaped in ways that persisted long after the immediate crisis. I envision weakened empires, contested territories, and changing power dynamics as rulers sought to maintain control over populations and resources. I feel the tension between central authority and local autonomy as communities navigated the balance between obedience and survival. The events of 536 demonstrated that environmental shocks could destabilize even the most established political systems, creating opportunities for reform, innovation, or collapse. I see how these pressures influenced governance strategies, succession planning, and administrative reforms for decades afterward. I also reflect on the psychological and cultural imprint of 536. I imagine generations growing up with stories of darkness, famine, and suffering, internalizing lessons about vulnerability, resilience, and the importance of preparedness. I feel the lasting impact on human perception, shaping caution, resourcefulness, and communal solidarity. This shared memory of catastrophe influenced not only individual behavior, but also societal values, informing decision-making, religious practices, and social norms for generations. The psychological legacy of 536 demonstrates how extreme events can leave enduring marks on culture, identity, and collective memory. Education and knowledge transmission were affected as well. I picture children growing up in households preoccupied with survival, learning practical skills and strategies for resilience. I feel the dual nature of this education, the loss of certain luxuries and opportunities, but the gain of practical wisdom, adaptability, and community cohesion. Societies emerged from 536 with lessons that informed future generations, emphasizing the importance of preparation, cooperation, and resource management. I see how these lessons were embedded in culture, ritual, and oral tradition, influencing both practical and moral education. The volcanic winter and famine also reshaped religious and philosophical thought. I imagine communities seeking explanations for the suffering, turning to theological interpretations, moral reflections, and philosophical inquiry. I feel the depth of human contemplation in response to adversity, the search for meaning, justice, and understanding. These reflections influenced religious teachings, moral codes, and societal norms, creating a framework through which future generations interpreted natural disasters and human suffering. The long-term impact of 536, therefore, extends beyond the material world into the spiritual and intellectual domains. I also consider the role of memory and record-keeping. I picture chroniclers, scribes, and historians documenting the events, preserving accounts of famine, social disruption, and environmental catastrophe. I feel the enduring power of these narratives, which allow us to reconstruct the events centuries later. The meticulous recording of experience became a form of resilience, ensuring that the lessons of 536 would not be lost. These records influenced subsequent generations, guiding responses to future crises and shaping historical consciousness. Social cohesion and community structures were transformed. I imagine neighborhoods, towns, and villages forced to develop new systems of cooperation, mutual aid, and conflict resolution. I feel the delicate balance between self-interest and collective responsibility, recognizing that survival depended on both. Communities that adapted effectively were able to endure and recover, while others fractured under the pressure. The long-term consequences of 536 reinforced the importance of social networks, trust, and cooperative strategies in maintaining stability and resilience. The events of 536 also influenced migration patterns, trade networks, and urban development. I picture displaced populations moving to cities, seeking employment, resources, and safety. I feel the tension this created: crowded streets, competition for resources, and the need for new social infrastructures. At the same time, these shifts facilitated cultural exchange, innovation, and economic adaptation. The crises of 536 reshaped human geography, altering patterns of settlement, commerce, and interaction in ways that persisted for decades. I reflect on the ecological lessons of 536. I imagine communities forced to reconsider their relationship with the land, developing strategies for sustainable agriculture, forest management, and resource allocation. I feel the importance of adaptation and foresight, recognizing that human societies are deeply intertwined with environmental conditions. The volcanic winter and famine demonstrated the fragility of human systems and the necessity of resilience, shaping future approaches to environmental management, agriculture, and disaster preparedness. Finally, as I stand in the shadow of history, I feel the profound long-term consequences of 536. I see demographic shifts, migrations, weakened political systems, altered economies, cultural and religious transformations, and enduring lessons in resilience and adaptation. I feel the deep interconnection between environmental events and human experience, recognizing that even a single year of extreme conditions can ripple through generations, shaping societies, cultures, and human consciousness. The year 536 was not merely a period of darkness. It was a turning point, a crucible in which humanity's vulnerabilities and strengths were laid bare. As I recount these events, I want you to feel the magnitude of their impact, not only the immediate suffering, but the enduring lessons that resonate across time. The long-term consequences of 536 remind us that human societies are deeply interconnected with the natural world, that resilience is essential, and that adaptation, cooperation, and foresight are critical for survival. I sense the courage, ingenuity, and perseverance of those who endured, and I hope that by understanding their experience, we can appreciate the enduring strength of the human spirit and the lessons history offers us in facing our own environmental and social challenges. As I sit with the weight of history on my shoulders, I reflect deeply on the events of 536 AD, and I begin to understand the immense lessons humanity can glean from such a year of darkness, famine, and upheaval. I try to imagine myself walking through the lives of those who endured these challenges, sensing their fear, resilience, and adaptability. Every struggle, every hardship, becomes a mirror reflecting not only the vulnerability of human societies, but also the remarkable capacity for endurance, learning, and transformation. I feel compelled to consider what they teach us, not just about survival, but about the broader human experience. One of the first lessons that strikes me is the fragility of human existence in the face of natural forces. I picture the dimmed sun, the failed crops, and the chilling cold that swept across regions, reminding me that human ingenuity, civilization, and technology are ultimately dependent on the environment. I feel the humbling realization that despite empires, armies, and wealth, people were rendered powerless against forces far greater than themselves. This teaches the profound importance of humility and understanding that no matter how advanced or organized a society becomes, it must respect and adapt to the natural world. The events of 536 show that survival is not just about strength or resources. It is about awareness, preparedness, and alignment with the rhythms of nature. I also sense the lesson of resilience etched into every aspect of human life during this period. I imagine families rationing food, communities sharing resources, and leaders striving to maintain order. I feel the determination, creativity, and courage that sustain them. Resilience, I realize, is not just an individual trait. It is a collective quality, cultivated through shared struggle, cooperation, and empathy. The people of 536 endured unimaginable hardship, yet they adapted, innovated, and persevered. This reminds me that resilience is not the absence of suffering, but the capacity to navigate it, to learn from it, and to emerge stronger, even when circumstances are dire. Another lesson lies in the profound interconnection between environmental, social, and political systems. I picture weakened harvests causing famine, famine fueling social unrest, and unrest challenging political authority. I feel the intricate web of cause and effect, where a single environmental event cascaded into profound societal consequences. This teaches the value of holistic thinking, understanding that decisions in one domain ripple across many others. Modern societies, I realize, can learn from this interconnectedness, recognizing that climate, health, economy, and governance are deeply intertwined, and that neglecting one aspect can jeopardize the stability of all. The human capacity for adaptation is another striking lesson. I imagine displaced communities finding new lands, artisans developing new methods of food storage, and neighbors cooperating in extraordinary ways. I feel admiration for the ingenuity that emerges under pressure, the creative solutions that allow survival even when traditional systems fail. This reminds me that adaptability is a cornerstone of human progress. While the events of 536 were catastrophic, they also catalyzed innovation, reorganization, and the evolution of social, economic, and agricultural practices. Humanity's ability to adapt, to improvise, and to learn from crisis is both a practical and philosophical lesson, demonstrating the enduring strength of the human spirit. The moral and ethical dimensions of human behavior during this period also stand out. I imagine communities deciding whether to share scarce food, rulers deliberating on resource allocation, and individuals balancing survival with compassion. I feel the profound weight of these ethical choices. The lesson here is that adversity reveals the core of human character, our capacity for both selfishness and generosity, fear and courage, despair and hope. I realize that the true measure of humanity is not how easily we thrive in abundance, but how we act under pressure when the stakes are high and resources are scarce. The events of 536 challenge us to reflect on our own ethical choices in times of difficulty, both individually and collectively. I also learned the importance of foresight and preparation. I picture the chroniclers, the leaders, and the communities who were caught unprepared for the sudden environmental shock. I feel the consequences of inadequate planning, famine, mortality, social unrest, and the critical value of anticipating challenges before they escalate. The lesson is clear. Preparedness is a form of resilience. Understanding history, anticipating risks, and implementing strategies to mitigate disaster are essential for the survival and well-being of both communities and nations. The experience of 536 teaches that while we cannot control nature, we can influence our response, preparedness, and capacity to endure its trials. Another profound lesson comes from the importance of community and social cohesion. I imagine towns and villages where survival depended on collective effort, cooperation, and mutual support. I feel the fragility of these social bonds, but also their extraordinary strength when cultivated. Communities that worked together, shared resources, and supported one another were far more likely to survive than those divided by fear or mistrust. The lesson resonates powerfully. Human connections, solidarity, and shared responsibility are not luxuries. They are essential for enduring hardship and overcoming adversity. In reflecting on 536, I see that the social fabric of a society is as critical to survival as its material resources. The events of 536 also teach the enduring importance of knowledge and record keeping. I picture scribes documenting the darkness, famine, and societal disruptions, ensuring that future generations could learn from these experiences. I feel the value of historical memory, the ability to analyze, interpret, and apply lessons from the past. Knowledge becomes a form of resilience, allowing humanity to anticipate, adapt, and respond to crises more effectively. The chronicling of 536 reminds me that preserving information, learning from experience, and sharing insights are fundamental to societal survival and evolution. Reflection on this period also reveals the profound psychological dimensions of crisis. I imagine individuals struggling with fear, grief, and uncertainty, yet finding ways to endure and maintain hope. I feel the importance of mental and emotional resilience, understanding that survival is not solely a physical endeavor, but a psychological one. The lessons of 536 underscore the need for inner strength, emotional regulation, and hope in the face of adversity. Communities that supported mental well-being, provided comfort, and fostered hope were better equipped to navigate prolonged crises. I also see lessons in humility, perspective, and the transient nature of human achievements. I picture grand empires, advanced cities, and sophisticated societies humbled by forces beyond their control. I feel the sobering reminder that progress is fragile and that human accomplishments, while impressive, can be vulnerable to environmental, social, or political upheaval. The events of 536 teach the importance of humility, the need to respect the environment, and the recognition that human ingenuity must be accompanied by foresight, caution, and adaptability. Moreover, I learn the value of empathy and understanding across generations. I imagine modern observers like myself trying to comprehend the struggles of those who lived through 536, connecting emotionally and intellectually with people separated by centuries. I feel the power of empathy to bridge time, to make history alive and relevant, and to transform abstract knowledge into deep human insight. The lesson is that history is not just a collection of dates and events. It is a living record of human experience, offering wisdom, guidance, and reflection for all who seek to understand it. I also reflect on the cyclical nature of human challenges. I see patterns repeating across centuries: environmental disruption, famine, social unrest, and adaptation. I feel a deep awareness that while circumstances may change, the underlying human responses, resilience, creativity, cooperation, fear, and ethical struggle remain consistent. The lesson here is one of humility and vigilance. By studying the past, we gain insight into recurring challenges and the strategies that have enabled human survival. The events of 536 remind me that history is a teacher, offering guidance and warning for the future. Finally, I contemplate the broader philosophical and existential lessons. I feel a sense of awe at human endurance, a recognition of the interconnectedness of nature, society, and individual action, and a deep respect for the lessons of lived experience. The darkness of 536 is not only a story of suffering, it is a story of perseverance, adaptation, and the enduring capacity of humans to find meaning, hope, and resilience in even the bleakest circumstances. I realize that reflection, learning,